Now that Mary Lou MacDonald has led Sinn Féin to electoral success in the Irish Republic, everyone is interested in its apparent links to the IRA. The British magazine The Economist, in an article on the likelihood of a united Ireland, says, "On February 8th, that duopoly was smashed apart when Sinn Féin got the largest share of first preference votes in the Republic's general election. The party, with links to the Irish Republican Army, which bombed and shot its way through the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. No bias there then. But of course, there is some truth to this. From the mid-1970s to the late 1990s, the Provisional Irish Republican Army waged one of the most devastating guerrilla campaigns in the history of the 20th century, culminating in a bombing campaign on mainland Britain that shook British society and the state to its foundations. Seeking revenge for the death of volunteer Bobby Sands and 9 other Republican prisoners who were allowed to die on hunger strike in the Long Kesh internment camp in 1981, the Provos turned their attention to Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, who refused to grant IRA prisoners special category status, almost killing her in the Brighton bomb attack in October 1984. Here is how Mrs. Thatcher responded to this attack.
And the fact that we are gathered here now, shocked, but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail.
The British government and media constructed a narrative of the conflict, which had come to be known as the Long War to Irish Republicans, a narrative that presented the IRA as little more than a gang of lawless thugs, a violent and criminal terrorist organisation, and naturally this was done without reference to the part Britain played in the Troubles. Everywhere in its many imperial and colonial projects, Britain's pattern of behaviour is the same. It invades and occupies a territory, divides its people against themselves by stoking sectarian tensions, and assumes the role of the civilised peacemaker so as to rule as though removed from the conflict. How Britain explained the war in Ireland was never quite the truth, but then Britain has never told or accepted the truth about its imperial adventures. In order to understand the Troubles and the IRA bombing campaign in Britain, we are forced to go back to the beginning of this phase of the Irish conflict, to the events leading up to and surrounding the Bloody Sunday massacre in Derry on the 30th of January 1972, a pivotal moment in the story of the Provisional IRA. Through the 1960s, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, a non-sectarian civil rights organisation, was campaigning for democracy in the province, demanding that the British government address anti-Catholic discrimination by legislating for one man, one vote. The civil rights movement also demanded the end of internment, the policy of arrest without charge and imprisonment without trial, that police violence be addressed, that housing policy be reformed so as to serve all the people of the province equally, and that laws be put in place to protect people's rights to the freedom of speech, assembly and association. All pretty basic human, civil and political rights, which at the time threatened the hegemony of the unionist ruling establishment in what was a de jure Protestant apartheid state. Rather than engage with the legitimate demands of the pro-democracy and cross-community civil rights movement, the British government, as part of Operation Banner, the military occupation of the 6 counties from August 1969 to July 2007, turned to the Parachute Regiment, an elite expeditionary force with extensive experience in warfare against civilian populations and rebellions in Britain's overseas colonies. On the morning of Monday the 9th of August 1971, the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment entered the Ballymurphy estate in Belfast, a Catholic housing estate, to arrest and detain members of the Provisional IRA, or so the British Army claimed. The murderous events of that day and the 2 following paint a different picture. Civilians were rounded up, assaulted and shot indiscriminately and without provocation in a ferocious and highly aggressive military action which has come to be known as the Ballymurphy massacre. Besides those wounded over this 3-day assault, 11 innocent people were killed. Among those were Francis Quinn, Father Hugh Mullen, and Joan Connolly. Francis Quinn, 19, was shot down as he tried to help a wounded man. Father Hugh Mullen, with a white handkerchief held high, was shot as he tried to help another wounded man. An army sniper then proceeded to shoot others who attempted to aid their priest. Joan Connolly, a 44-year-old mother of 8, was shot as she passed the army barracks. Members of the Parachute Regiment prevented anyone coming to her assistance. She died several hours later on the grass where she fell. The British state has acted to suppress details of the Ballymurphy massacre, and the Northern First Minister Arlene Foster, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, deferred a bid for extra funding for inquests into historic killings in the North, a decision condemned by Amnesty International. 6 months after the Ballymurphy massacre in Belfast, on the 30th of January 1972, a planned civil rights march led by the Civil Rights Association went ahead in the city of Derry in the west of the province. Thousands went out on the march, a peaceful demonstration asking for basic civil rights, men, women and children. Again, using the excuse that it was searching for IRA members, one para entered the city through the police and army roadblocks. It went in hot, primed with live ammunition, and given the order to shoot to kill. A scene from James McGovern's 2002 film, Sunday.
Against the fucking wall! Turn your fucking round! Go! Fucking against the wall! Out of the fucking wall and go! For God's sake! Against the wall! Fucking turn against the fucking wall! I'll slow you! Don't you fucking move! Go! You fucking down!
He's coming, son. Pretend you're dead. Pretend you're dead, son.
During the first inquest into the events of Bloody Sunday, the Widgery inquest, the evidence of the soldiers that they were fired upon by IRA gunmen was accepted uncritically, and so too was the evidence that one of the teenage victims was found carrying nail bombs. In fact, 17-year-old Jerry Donaghy had received medical attention earlier. His pockets had been searched for identification, and no explosives were found. The car rushing him to hospital was stopped at a British Army checkpoint. Its occupants were detained, but later released without charge. Jerry was left to die in the car. Moreover, not a single piece of evidence was recovered to corroborate the claim made by the soldiers that they had been fired upon. In all, 13 innocent people were killed on the day, and a 14th died months later in hospital. The Saville inquiry concluded in 2010, after decades of pressure from the families of the victims and the people of Derry, that the paras opened fire without provocation, and that all the victims were innocent civil rights marchers. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister at the time, apologised and accepted wrongdoing, but to date, not one member of one para has been brought to justice. What we do know, however, is that even before the march, the British Army had made the decision to shoot civil rights ringleaders so as to make examples of them. Ahead of the Derry March in January 1972, General Robert Ford, the commander of the British land forces in the occupied counties, sent a confidential memo to General Harry Tussaud, recommending a shoot-to-kill policy. He wrote, I am coming to the conclusion that the minimum force necessary to achieve a restoration of law and order is to shoot selected ringleaders amongst the Derry young hooligans, after clear warnings have been issued. No warning was issued on the day of the march. Not a great look here for the Parachute Regiment and the British Army. No IRA provocation, no evidence of guns or shell casings recovered, clear evidence of bombs being planted on a young victim, and a massacre of innocent, unarmed civilians. But what of the IRA? It is likely that members of the official IRA, not to be confused with the Provisional IRA, did fire a number of shots in retaliation, but the British government and the British Army on the ground knew perfectly well that neither the official nor the Provisional IRA was at fighting strength and capable of fighting an open street battle with the British Army, let alone the more aggressive Parachute Regiment. J. Boyer Bell, a US expert on the IRA, spells this out for us. Yet the movement remained stalled, trapped between the orthodox and the radical. Worse, there were only rare successes for either persuasion. Despite Sinn Féin's carefully wrought electoral programme, the results of the local elections in 1976 were almost unmitigated disaster. The rare victories came despite the Sinn Féin label, not because of it. The voters, when they thought about Sinn Féin at all, considered the Republicans hopeless cranks, and even formerly loyal voters saw no need to waste their franchise when there was no campaign to support. Funds were sadly lacking. The United Irishmen long hovered on the lip of insolvency. Clan na Gael had splintered so often that nothing could be expected from America. Where allegiances were shifting and the ties of the old country loosening, the new Clan na HÉireann in Britain was hardly a replacement. Within the IRA, the strain of maintaining an inactive army was as onerous as ever. Despite a variety of organisational alternatives suggested by committees and individuals, GHQ continued to depend on organisers rushing out from Dublin to patch up uncontrolled leaks. Within 5 years, the IRA seemed composed mainly of the impatient young and the exhausted old. The effort was a tremendous drain on Republican energies and produced very little visible return on the investment beyond creating a disgruntled and impatient army of rapidly shifting personnel. Astute and not necessarily unsympathetic observers gave the movement only a few more years before it decayed into a bitter band of old malcontents husbanding their humiliations at annual ceremonies. End quote. While we know members of the IRA were present in Derry on the day of the march, we know, and the British Army knew at the time, there was no Provisional IRA involvement in the Bloody Sunday massacre. Bloody Sunday was an intentional assault by the Parachute Regiment on the civilian population, designed to terrorise people and break the strength of the Civil Rights Association. Without glorifying the war fought by the Provisional IRA, and it was a war, we are forced to concede the truth of the statement. The British Army was the greatest recruiting sergeant the IRA ever had. Bloody Sunday put an end to the peaceful response to occupation, discrimination and oppression. Frustrated and angry, young women and men from all over Ireland filled the ranks of the Provisional IRA. Funds came pouring in from America and Britain, and as a result of British violence, the IRA was again in a position to wage an armed insurgency against Britain, a foreign military occupier with a proven track record for brutality and for extremely violent repression and murderous attacks on civilians, a tactic Britain had always used in Ireland. Yet working alongside Britain's terror campaign in Ireland, it was fighting a propaganda war geared to convince people in Britain and around the world that the Provos were nothing but violent and criminal terrorists bent on destruction and mayhem. At those rare moments when it was exposed or nearly exposed as the aggressor, it fell back on a disingenuous moral equivalence, manufacturing the myth that one side was as bad as the other. effectively throwing the loyalist and unionist communities under the bus while denying its own partisan involvement in the conflict it, and it alone, had created. This said, it is not to be taken from this that the IRA, official or provisional, was without blame. Former IRA volunteers and Sinn Féin activists are among the first to admit the IRA made mistakes, that innocent people were wrongly killed, that atrocities happened, and that war crimes were committed. The Republican cause for a united, free Irish Republic never was a sectarian cause. The Republic is not a Catholic cause or an ethno-nationalist cause. It is a campaign for an Irish Republic for all the people of Ireland, Catholic and Protestant, free to choose their own course without the interference of Britain or any other foreign occupier. But we must be clear. The Irish Republican Army, whatever our personal opinions concerning its history and actions, was a national army of liberation fighting a war of independence in a context in which Irish people were being denied their fundamental rights to life, democracy and freedom by a foreign invader. Under international law, this was a perfectly justifiable armed struggle.